I'll be real, I don't really have a justification for this one. Usually when I do these ranking videos, I try to come up with a reason why we're ranking the subject at hand. Some reason why it's important to talk about, or some justification for why this topic in particular is more interesting to cover. I don't have anything like that this time. I just want to talk about Sonic Adventure 1, and this is a good format for getting all of my thoughts across. This is going to be a sort of mini review of the game, just going over each of the different stories in the game and giving a brief summary of all of my thoughts. Anyway, basically everything in each of these campaigns is going to be up for grabs in terms of ranking. The gameplay of the levels, the segments of gameplay between the levels, and the cutscenes and story beats within. Now, gameplay is going to be paramount here, but everything will at least be considered. Alright, that's enough waffling, let's go ahead and get started. I know, very brave of me to put Big on the bottom of this list. Big's fishing adventure has been a meme online for a long time, and it's not very hard to see why. It's just such a huge departure from the rest of the game that it almost feels like a joke, like something that someone made up in an improv bit. Like, hey, what if in the middle of the next Mario game you had to take a break to play football with some random Goombas for a while? That's literally what Big's campaign is. I think most people here would start to complain about how the gameplay itself is quite bad, complain about how bad the fishing mechanics are and how bad the level design in these segments are, but I don't think I actually agree with that. Outside of the ice level, which is annoying to navigate as Big and pretty annoying to figure out how to break the ice apart so you can actually start fishing, most of these levels are perfectly fine. The fishing itself is a bit frustrating, but as long as you're patient, it's not that bad. When I've gone back to record footage for Big in other videos, I usually actually had a really nice time with the fishing mechanics. It's not poorly designed in terms of level design or in basic mechanics. I think the problem is just that it straight up does not belong in the game. At least, not as a mandatory part of the game that you have to get through to progress. Like, you guys know the Chow Garden, right? The best part of the Sonic Adventure games, that thing that people correctly keep begging Sega to bring back. While I think the Chow Garden is better implemented mechanics-wise as well, the main reason people respond to the Chow Garden better than Big's fishing sections is because you aren't forced to do the Chow Garden. You do it because you want to, because the mechanics themselves are fun and the Chow are really cute. But the gameplay of the Chow Garden itself is something that a lot of people wouldn't really jive with. Sonic Adventure is a platformer, and the vast majority of the game is about platforming. Forcing the player to pause the game and do something from an entirely different genre for an hour or two is just a bad idea, regardless of how fun that segment of the game is. It's the same problem as that stupid pinball machine in Sonic Frontiers. Why is this in the game, Sega? What the fuck? If you were forced to win a Chow race in order to complete the game, this section would be despised because it wouldn't be a fun extra. It would be a chore you were forced to do to get to the fun stuff. And that's what most people view Big's campaign as, a chore. It's something you have to do because the game tells you you have to. And regardless of how good the mechanics of the fishing itself are, when most people boot up Sonic Adventure, they're there to play Sonic Adventure, not to play Sega Bass Fishing for the Dreamcast. This would probably be a beloved part of the game if it were a side mode. Hell, most people like the fishing spots in Frontiers to bring up that game again. Shoving in this concept that's so fundamentally different from the rest of the game as a mandatory part of game completion was never going to go over well. This section of the game is maybe a bit overhated, but at the same time, I totally understand why it has such a sour reputation. Now on to the first story based around proper platforming. Knuckles' story is one that disappoints me to no end. For what it's worth, I think the actual plot of Knuckles' campaign is pretty interesting. Learning more about Knuckles' ancestry is neat, and while that is something that goes on throughout the entire game, getting to see Knuckles himself interact with the call has an extra edge to it that none of the other segments do. That's just about the end of the nice things I have to say about Knuckles' story, though. The treasure hunter gameplay in the adventure games was never really perfected, and honestly, I think their first attempt at it was the best. Throwing shade at SA2 aside, I just don't enjoy the actual gameplay here. The issue is, a combination of several things, but the worst of them all is Sonic Adventure's camera. You can't look up or down with the camera in game, only rotate it around you, and even then, this doesn't work as well as you'd like a lot of the time. This makes getting adjusted to your surroundings pretty difficult, which is really bad because surveying your surroundings is a big part of this campaign's gameplay. However, the bad camera isn't that big of a deal because you don't really need to look at your surroundings very often because you have a hot or cold indicator at the bottom of your screen that tells you where you need to go. Combine this with Knuckles' busted movement options in 3D, being able to climb up any surface and then glide around to get basically anywhere you want to be, and you end up with a series of levels where you're not really incentivized to actually pay attention to your surroundings. The gameplay loop of most of Knuckles' levels is as follows. Climb up to a high place, glide around like an idiot until the thing on the bottom of your screen starts beeping, then close in on its location until something blocks your path. And then you actually engage with the level's mechanics to try to figure out why you can't get the piece of the Master Emerald yet. Rinse and repeat. The worst part is that this remains largely the most effective strategy for most of the game. So until you know the game super well and repeat playthroughs, this is how you will approach most of the levels. I feel like this would have worked a lot better if you went through the exact same levels with Knuckles that you did with another character. So you'd be combing through an area that you already knew from earlier. But that wouldn't really work because most Sonic levels aren't designed for backtracking. It's just a really difficult situation to remedy. This type of gameplay could make a successful comeback with the directions that Frontier is taking the series, but I just don't think it quite worked out in the adventure games. Another small note is that trying to find the keys to the temple as Knuckles is probably the most frustrating adventure area quest in the entire game, so that's fun. Amy's campaign is pretty much the embodiment of average. The actual plot of the adventure is one of the more competent stories here. Not quite a standout, but she at least has a character arc, even if the cutscenes themselves aren't all that. However, the main thing that sticks out here is the gameplay. Amy's gameplay is very bare bones, and I mean that in a bad way. Her movement is noticeably slower than Sonic and Tails, but unlike Gamma or Big, this isn't to shift the focus away from platforming and towards other elements. Instead, it's just kind of a worse version of Sonic's movement. Unlike other games, they don't quite give Amy enough here to make her stand out. Her hammer swing is very slow and difficult to really use, and it's often more fun to just avoid enemies entirely rather than fight them. The most fun thing you have is the hammer flip that she does while at top speed, and while that is awesome, it's really hard to actually get much use out of because you can only do it while at top speed, and thanks to Amy's worse physics and the level design of her stages, it's kind of difficult to optimize around that. Obviously, playing through a level over and over again to get better times is kind of the point of Sonic, but I can't imagine trying to optimize Amy's levels over some of the other ones here, considering how unpleasant her basic movement is. I mean, does she really have to be this slow compared to the other characters? Still, Amy's campaign is probably the first one here who I generally enjoyed the playthrough of the first time around, rather than generally being annoyed by it, but I still think the other stories here are a lot more fun. To start this section off, I just want to say that Gamma's plotline is one of the best ones in the game. It did genuinely make me sad when I was playing through it, and I really respect this game trying this hard with this story, even if I don't think it perfectly stuck the landing. The impact of this story is helped a lot by the fact that we have never seen Gamma come back in any of the subsequent entries of the franchise. Though I'm not sure how much credit you can give to Sonic Adventure specifically for that. As for the gameplay, Gamma's levels are fine, but not the most fun thing in the game. The shooting mechanics are perfectly adequate, but I definitely feel like this would have benefited from a dedicated twin stick setup of some kind. Having to change where your character is standing to aim your gun is just a bit finicky. Worse is how you have to fire. The whole holding the button to lock on and then release to fire doesn't really feel all that intuitive, and worse, you can kind of just mash the button and shoot at everything that way, and it usually works better anyway. This means that actually playing Gamma's levels requires constant button mashing, which gets old really fast. Outside of the small control issues, most of the actual levels in Gamma's campaign are really fun to play through. His movement, while a bit stiff compared to Sonic and Tails, is well built for his gameplay, and the time attack angle is interesting. Having to constantly worry about the time can be a bit annoying at points, but it makes you focus on the gameplay from a completely different angle, and as long as you put some effort into keeping your time up, it's probably not going to be that big of an issue. One small downside of Gamma's story is that it has the most rival fights of any campaign, and the rival fights are hilariously easy in this game, so they're mostly a waste of your time more than anything. Still, they're not exactly frustrating, so it doesn't detract from the overall experience. While Gamma's gameplay is overall fine, I wouldn't want an entire game of it. The other campaigns are just a lot better, but the existence of Gamma's campaign does make the game better overall, I think. Unlike Big's campaign, it's a change of pace that's close enough to what the game is about that it ultimately adds to the experience rather than detracting from it. You could probably argue that Supersonic's campaign shouldn't count for the purposes of this video, but I figured I'd go ahead and talk about it anyway. Supersonic's campaign is hard carry by pure aura. The actual gameplay here isn't all that great. I personally found the fight against Perfect Chaos just a bit frustrating because it felt like I would clip against something slightly wrong and lose all of my speed and end up running out of rings, and it got pretty frustrating after a first couple of attempts. But at the same time, it's just so fucking cool, man. In fact, one of my biggest complaints about this final story is that after you finish Perfect Chaos' first health bar, they stop playing Open Your Heart and switch to a different, non-peak song. Fuck's up with that? Still, it's a really cool set piece, and the boss fight is generally really fun. And the first half of the boss fight has a banger soundtrack, obviously. Plot-wise, it's a good conclusion to the game's overall story. Tikal and Chaos are finally at peace after centuries of struggle, and as much as I rag on this game's cutscenes, I still thought it was pretty sweet. There are definitely some moments in this part that don't work perfectly. Sonic being able to go supersonic here at all feels like a bit of an ass pull, and Tails' infamous line at the end of the game is memed on for a reason. Still, all of that feels just a bit nitpicky, and I don't have any major complaints about the story besides the gameplay itself leaving just a bit to be desired. Tails' campaign is the most consistently fun in the entire game. While it never hits the highs of the last campaign on this list, there's not even a single level in this campaign that I actually dislike. Every level is fun to fly through, and Tails' movement is really fun to play around with. The race gimmick adds just a little bit to the gameplay while mostly allowing you to focus on platforming, making this one of the only couple of campaigns of the game to focus directly on the most fun part of Sonic games. It's also really fun to find skips and mess around with Tails' flying ability. It's kind of crazy to me that they just don't try to stop you from skipping massive sections of the race course. In fact, it almost seems like they encourage you to do so, which feels weird from someone who's more used to modern games and the litany of invisible walls and such. I only have a couple of complaints about the gameplay in Tails' campaign. For one, did we really need to go through the Sky Chase minigames 2 more times? I really think that once was enough, and honestly, even the encore of it in Sonic's campaign felt kinda pointless and boring. The campaign is also largely too easy. As fun as flying around is, it does invalidate most of the actual obstacles in the game, and it feels like this could have been more fun if they had designed the obstacles around Tails' flight instead of just pitting you against Sonic in a race. Still, none of that really makes me dislike the campaign at all. It's still really fun to actually play in moment-to-moment gameplay. The actual story of this campaign is one I really enjoy. It's great to see finally Tails get a win over Eggman through his own effort, and it feels like he's actually grown a lot as a person by the end of the story. I made a whole video about why Tails in this character arc hit me really hard, and you could go watch that for more details if you want. I swear I'm not mentioning this just because that video performed really poorly, by the way. Anyway, Tails' campaign is overall really enjoyable, but I think we all kind of already knew what the number one spot was going to be. Let's go ahead and start this section by talking about what I don't like about this campaign compared to the others. The actual story itself is honestly pretty bad. It's a standard Sonic stops Eggman plot without any themes, except there's all this awkwardness with Sonic basically collecting the Chaos Emeralds for Eggman because he can't stop him from getting literally any of them. There's nothing of substance here, and the moment-to-moment plot is just not very well done. Of course, that stuff doesn't really matter because Sonic's levels are the most fun in the entire game. There are a few stinkers in here. I didn't really like the level on Eggman's ship, and the casino level is just okay. I know some people would really hate that level, but I didn't mind it that much. I just would have preferred more platforming gameplay as opposed to pinball. However, the other levels are all really fun to play through. As jank as they can be, this is honestly a great first attempt at 3D Sonic platforming. The set pieces are honestly really impressive given the time this game was released, and the basic moment-to-moment gameplay is a really good first attempt at translating Sonic's moveset into a 3D environment. Speaking of Sonic's moveset, let's go into a bit more detail on that. It's not my favorite Sonic moveset of all time. There are a few notable exclusions. Not having the bounce from SA2 or any sort of stomp move to let you go downward really quickly is a bit lame. And the Lightspeed Dash being something you have to charge up is just really fucking dumb. However, the fact that you could start a spin dash and then release it immediately to get the top speed out of nowhere is just so much fun. It's maybe something that you shouldn't actually be allowed to do in the game, given that it allows you to recover from almost any mistake with almost no time lost, but it's just so much fun to actually do that I kinda don't mind. Also, this is the game that introduced the homing attack, which is one of the things that I think makes 3D Sonic so much fun. It's a really natural feeling way to make combat a bigger part of Sonic platforming, and I can see why the rest of the series stuck with it. One thing that I'm going to go ahead and mention here, mostly because I haven't talked about it anywhere else, is that Sonic has the lion's share of the boss fights. The boss fights in this game range from just okay to outright bad, unfortunately. The Egg Viper is pretty alright if a little jank, but most of the fights against Chaos are only passable at best. Chaos 4 in particular is fought like 3 times, and it's interesting because each of those fights play so differently thanks to the different movesets of each of the characters. However, each of these fights are all pretty much equally mid because the boss fight itself is just not that good, and the differences in movement don't change how you approach the fight all that much. It's a fine fight for the first time through, but after you get ready to fight Chaos 4 for like the 3rd time, you're pretty done with it. The other fights just don't have much notable to say about them. The fight against the Egg Hornet is like there, but it's not that fun or interesting. Still, none of that really matters in the face of just how fun Sonic's individual levels are. This campaign is usually seen as the best part of the game, and I absolutely agree. Outside of the story itself not being anything worth writing home about, this is the absolute best that Sonic Adventure as a game has to offer. And that's about all I have to say about Sonic Adventure as a game. I could maybe make a more long-form review with my overall thoughts at some point if you guys wanted to see that, but I mostly just wanted to talk about this game at all. If you're still here and you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps the channel out. Anyway, with all that said, I'll see you all next time.